Good afternoon to you all. My name is Jerry Power, and I am the National Head of Sales for Emergence, and I will be your host for today's webinar. The webinar series is an ongoing feature of our educational initiative to build the cyber knowledge of our broker partners and their clients. We have one of the biggest audiences of the webinar series today, with nearly 1,000 brokers and clients registered for today's webinar, which gives you an insight into how many of you are interested in building your knowledge on cyber. I think it's also because we have a global cyber insurance expert who is monitoring cyber from a global perspective, and I'll talk more about Scott Bailey later. I'm pleased to advise all attendees will be entitled to 1 CPD point for attending today's webinar. As many of you would know, cyber issues are one of the most topical issues within the insurance industry today, largely because of the amount of data breaches we're hearing and seeing in the media. Today, we would like to share with you our insights into the results from the latest report into the Notifiable Data Breaches scheme, which came out recently. We're delighted we have a global cyber leader with us today in the form of Scott Bailey from Markel International in London, who are one of Emergence's security partners. I will be chatting to Scott as to what he sees from a global perspective. He will also be answering questions which have been sent to us prior to the webinar. He's also happy to take questions from you today. If you want to post a question to Scott during the webinar, please use the question icon on your screen, and we'll try and answer as many questions as possible in the Q&A session or beforehand. Our US legend, Jeff Gonlin, will, as usual, walk us through an interesting claim that Emergence has managed in its own portfolio recently. And finally, I'll give you an update on what Emergence have been up to and giving you an insight into our plans for the future. We plan for this webinar to go for 50 minutes with an additional 10 minutes for Q&A. Due to the fact we have the benefit of Scott joining us today, we're going to be flexible on the format so that we can allocate as much time for your questions as possible. We might run a few minutes over based on the amount of questions we get from the audience. As a thank you to all of you who've joined the webinar today, we're running a competition to win a fantastic Google Home for any of you who follow us on LinkedIn between now and next Tuesday, and I will provide you with more details later. So as you can see, we've got plenty to share with you today. As sometimes happens in Emergence webinars, none of the speakers really speak English, so if you've got no idea what we're saying, just follow the slides. Before we get going today, I want to thank all those brokers who voted us as in the Broker on Underwriting Agency survey conducted by Insurance Business. We were very proud to have won the 2 cyber categories, which were cyber category for the best coverage, deductibles, education and technology platform, and the Broker's Pick Award, which is for the top cyber insurance product provided by an agency market in the last 12 months. We've now won this award in 3 out of the last 4 years. So thank you so much for those of you who voted for us. We really appreciate you showing us how much you value the effort of the dedicated Emergence team. Now, my picture hasn't improved from the last webinar, but the good news is, yesterday we had a professional photographer take new photos of the team, so you won't need to suffer for the next webinar. The Notifiable Data Breaches scheme came into effect 12 months ago last week, interestingly enough. Recently, the Privacy Commissioner released their 4th report into the scheme, which gives us a full year's insight into the NDB scheme. The report highlighted what Emergence expected, which was a continued increase in data breaches being notified to the Commissioner. Bear in mind, what is being reported is only those data breaches that companies have chosen to report. It does not deal with the issue that we believe is lurking in the business community, which is rampant data breaches that are still hidden from customers or the public. The latest report shows us that there were 262 data breaches notified in the last 3 months alone. The two key drivers of data breaches continue to be human error and criminal attacks. The number of data breaches is increasing every quarter. Since the NDB scheme came into effect, we've had 812 data breaches reported. Putting that figure in perspective, for the 12 months prior to the NDB scheme, there were only 114 notifications in total. This means there's been a 612% increase in data breaches in the first year of the NDB. To me, this says that the federal government have achieved its objective to bring data breaches above the table. Its research into community expectations is that if people's personal information or passwords have been compromised, they want to know about it. So what information is being stolen? Contact information such as name, address, and email are by far what is being compromised. 85% of data compromised involves contact information, and startling and concerning is 47% of breaches include bank account and our credit card details. So there's a real financial impact to these sort of data breaches when you think half of them are involving credit card or bank details. As I mentioned before, the main sources of data losses are malicious or criminal attacks and human error. I know malicious breaches such as phishing, malware, or brute force attacks are responsible for nearly 2/3 of data breaches, but I prefer to concentrate on the issue that concerns me most, which is the human error factor. As humans, we've got that great skill of finding new ways to make mistakes. The latest report shows us that employee mistakes are responsible for 1/3 of data breaches. The thing that frustrates me about this statistic is that it is an issue that's within our control as business. If business have proper policies and procedures in place through a risk management process, a large amount of these data breaches could be prevented. You, as brokers, have an important role to play in pushing this risk management education piece. By improving their risk management policies and procedures, business can improve their security posture and in return, reduce their cyber insurance premiums. Employees need to understand that when the security controls fail to stop an attack, such as a phishing campaign, it is the employees who are the last line of defense. It's the staff who need to be educated to identify a dodgy email or a suspicious invoice. The latest report confirms that some employees are just not paying attention, whether it's emails or mail sent to the wrong person, or staff CCing the entire world instead of blind copying them. Employee awareness education organizations tell us that approximately 15% of staff will click on a phishing email at least once a year. If a business has, let's say, 50 staff, that means approximately 7 staff are going to put the business at risk of ransomware every year. In the latest report, human error breaches on average affected 17,700 individuals. Research in Australia suggests that a data breach costs $139 a client record, and if you've got 17,700 records, you can do the maths yourself. You're talking about a massive cost to business, and Scott will talk about that a bit more in a while. The thing to remember is this is what's happening in our backyard. It's not happening anywhere else in the world. These are things that are happening in business today. Emergence will be announcing some new initiatives soon to assist you and your clients in reducing the impact of human error data breaches. So looking at the data breaches caused by malicious or criminal attacks, These were responsible for 2/3 of all data breaches, and cyber incidents were responsible for 68% of them. Interestingly, social engineering, which is a hot topic in Australian cyber and crime markets, was only responsible for 5% of malicious attacks. The key attack vector was phishing emails, which we've already spoken about. The other interesting insight provided by the latest quarterly report is the industries impacted by data breaches. For the 4th report in a row, the healthcare industry proves to be the industry that is the worst performer for keeping data secure. Data breaches in the healthcare industry increased 20% just in the last quarter. In the healthcare industry, human error is the biggest vector, with over half of all data breaches caused by human error, compared to 33% for all industries. So it just gives you an insight as to how education within healthcare is critical to get those data breaches down. So as you can see, after 12 months of operation, the NDB scheme is having a material impact on the disclosure of data breaches. It is obvious that as awareness of the NDB scheme continues and data breaches continue being topical news on mainstream media and in social media, the need to manage data breaches becomes more critical to the survival of business. From a broker's perspective, look at the industries your clients are operating in and consider whether you need to have a cyber conversation with them. We've developed a handy one-page NDB report snapshot, which you can send to clients to inform them of what data breaches are happening. You can find it on the products page of the Emergence website in the marketing collateral section. So let's change things up a bit and widen our perspective to what's happening on the global stage. Today, we're honored to have Scott Bailey with us down under. Scott Bailey is the Managing Director of Cyber at Markel International in London. Scott has spent the last 18 years at the coalface of cyber market. Scott began his cyber insurance underwriting career at a pioneering MGA in London market in 2001. Scott spent 12 years there, heading up their cyber and technology underwriting team for the last 7 years of that time. Following that, Scott joined CNA's Cyber and Technology Division as their European Underwriting Director. Markel's desire to create an all-new emerging risk offering lured Scott in 2013, and in the last 5 years, Scott successfully developed a large, profitable portfolio of cyber business. Just last month, Scott was promoted to his current managing director role with global responsibility for all things cyber. Whilst all that sounds impressive, Scott has a dark side. He's an Arsenal supporter. And so could all you Man United fans please refrain from posting inappropriate questions about why Arsenal are now in the top 4 of the EPL and Man United aren't. So, Scott, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Cyber is a very topical issue for good reason. We asked our broker partners to submit questions that they'd like answered to gain an insight into your experience as a global writer of cyber insurance. So let's start with, in your view, what are the top 3 cyber threats you see from a global perspective?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for listening in today. Thanks for making me feel very, very old, Jerry, and for also being slightly embarrassed to be an Arsenal supporter, but there we go. So without further ado, so the first question we've got here, what are the top 3 cyber threats you see from a global perspective? I'm actually not going to answer this with a sort of risk-specific hat on. This one has to be along the area of systemic risks. And you know, in case it's not obvious to anyone that's dialed into the call today, cyber risk really knows no boundaries. It's not geographically confined. So the first one here has got to be systemic risk, without a doubt. And the scope for cyber threats really to hit whole portfolios or global eclectic mixes of companies, all from the same self-propagating virus or issue. So that's definitely one concern. I think the second one for me is silent cyber as well. I think silent cyber, for those of you that haven't already heard of this phrase, is the presence of cyber exposure in a non-cyber policy. So, for example, a marine or a home insurance or a commercial package policy where there's no cyber exclusion or no cyber cover, leaving it very open to interpretation and indeed to systemic exposures as well. So that's definitely an item. And then finally, state-sponsored hacking. I think state-sponsored actors and state-sponsored hacking is generally a big issue for the world over. You look at things like NotPetya that occurred a year or two ago now, widely alleged to be from the Russian or Russian intelligence aimed at the Ukrainians. And unfortunately, that virus became widespread and all too easily. So, and there's also the additional point on attribution and actually nation states being attributable to any of these attacks or whether they ever, in fact, ever admit to any of them. So those are the three in my eyes that are the biggest headaches.
That's interesting. So can you give us examples of cyber attacks that you're seeing in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, you know, one thing that's worth saying is if you put an Australian hat on, I don't think the trends are that much different to other territories, but I'll certainly talk you through a few trend areas of topical claims that we're seeing. The first one's really cryptojacking. So that's the concept of hackers diverting computing power to generate cryptocurrency. And that sounds fairly innocent, but if you imagine a server room stacked with very complex equipment, all instructing other systems to generate cryptocurrency, actually can be quite costly to a business. So that's one new sort of cover area that's happening at the moment. Second trend that I'm seeing is probing of SCADA control systems, operational tech in an industrial context. So you've probably all sort of seen it in various press contexts, but there's a lot of probing going on. And again, the phrase state-sponsored or nation-state sponsored is probably one that springs to mind. But people are trying to find out if these systems are susceptible to hacking. Obviously, the worrisome aspect of this is that if it is a core system that runs infrastructure for a country, that's a dangerous day. And then the third element of cyber attacks that is a new one, perhaps a little controversial, but it's sextortion, it's called. And it's the sentiment of a hacker actually capturing some sort of webcam footage of a user perhaps caught in an inappropriate position looking at a website they shouldn't be, and then using that evidence to extort sometimes cryptocurrency or other means of currency from that individual or company. So that's definitely a third trend. They're the three emerging trends we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, we're seeing a number of those sextortion type activities where we're getting phone calls, just people concerned about what they should do for their next steps. So moving on, what are your predictions for the global regulatory landscape? We've had a lot of change in the last 18 months in Europe and Australia. Walk us through your thoughts.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, the whole Cambridge Analytica Facebook backdrop to what the right moral thing to do with data, and in fact what the right legal thing to do with data is a huge debate right now. And here in Australia, you've got the NDB Notifiable Data Breach scheme, and actually if you look at GDPR, it takes things to a new level. It's not just about data breaches and how you should communicate that to your clients. It's about actually upstanding and how you deal with that data in the first place, in what context you should collect it, in what context you should share it. And I think the future is going to look a lot like a lot of individuals wanting more control over what their data, when it's given and how it's used. So I think that's going to be one trend. Insurability of fines, there's a hot potato. So we've asked as an insurer many different regulators from differing countries, and none of them are really willing to give a clear answer. From all of the questions we've posed, they're very much commenting that insurability of fines, such as fines that might be levied under the Notifiable Data Breach, General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, it will all depend on the context of the individual situation before a regulator will give their views on insurability. That really doesn't help an insurer or an insured, because the reality is not knowing until that moment of a big award is really too late in the day. And I think insurers and insureds deserve a bit more clarity than that. And then finally, I think my personal view is that there needs to be an initiative on sort of like a cross-border fund transfer fraud task force. And when I say that, what I mean is, you know, fund transfer fraud, the moment money disappears beyond a border from one country to the next, it's incredibly difficult to collaborate with a different country and try to get those funds back when they've clearly been ill-gotten in a criminal way. I think the reality is siloed country by country approaches don't work in the context of a global situation like this.
Yeah, it's a challenge. You know, you've got the criminal environment at the leading edge, and you've got the regulators then multiple years behind, and there's no doubt it's a challenge. The other thing, the sort of conversations I have with brokers around the country is getting clients to understand that if you're an Australian business and you're collecting or harvesting European data, you need to comply with the NDB as well as the EU GDPR. So the requirements for GDPR are much more stricter than the Australian landscape and causes in some ways regulatory conflict. And we saw this with the Page Up breach, whereby the UK had to disclose the breach in 72 hours. Australia was 30 days, but because we're in a global media environment, the Australian disclosure couldn't wait.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a question just come through from one of the listeners today about whether Australia should adopt a similar standard to the GDPR in Europe. It's a tricky one to answer. I think there are a lot of moral benefits of GDPR, and I think there are lots of big global tech companies, without naming names, that are falling foul of it a hell of a lot right now. And I think the world is learning a lot about how their data has unfortunately been misused and given to third parties without their consent and things like that. So in answer to the question that's been posed, I think it does bring about significant benefits. It can be, unfortunately, a sledgehammer to crack a nut at times as well, though. You can get so caught up with the red tape that goes with it that it is a significant overhead and burden for any business. So, you know, yes, it will bring benefit, but be aware there's a cost element to it as well.
Yeah, and brokers, heads up for you. There's been some interesting developments in the Australian Federal Parliament in the last few months, where it went relatively unnoticed, but a new privacy bill got submitted to the Senate by, I think it was the Greens. It passed through the Senate, which suggested that Australia should adopt the GDPR model for Australia. Now, because it was the Greens who tabled the bill in the Senate, it went to the House of Reps then, which was controlled by the Liberals. The Liberals didn't agree with the bill, and therefore it didn't get through. But heads up, that bill is sitting there waiting to be implemented. And as we saw with the Royal Commission, once the government loses their numbers in the House of Reps, then you lose the ability to control the legislation that goes through the houses. So, Scott, why has Emergence expanded its panel of Lloyd syndicates on the program?
It's a good question. It's because you guys are so damn good at what you do, if I'm brutally honest. So you guys have had an amazing success story for the last 3 years. I think you showed a slide earlier on. Brokers clearly love what you're doing. You've got easy to understand policy language, really supported well with expert lawyers and panels of claims providers. All of that has led about to significant premium growth over the last 3 years. Markel, myself, and many others in the cyber market have always believed in strong diversification of portfolio. That's by industry, by geography, by size of insureds and everything else. And truth be told, the reality is that Markel felt that we needed to diversify our global portfolio a little bit further. And from what I understand, you guys secured some stellar other London support. And yeah, long may that continue.
Yeah, and it was an interesting process because we need to manage our growth, you need to manage yours. And when we canvassed other markets to see whether they wanted to be involved in the program, I think Troy was saying that the capacity was 3 times oversubscribed. So
it wouldn't surprise me, and actually it's testament to the job that you guys do and the fantastic support that your brokers give you.
yeah, and the advantage now, we're in a position where we've got 3 syndicates on the program. There's loads of capacity for future-proofing the business so that we won't have to seek further capacity in the next few years. But also what was compelling was the new syndicates had a different thought process and a different underwriting philosophy in terms of some areas where Emergence want to bring the business. So that was an interesting process from our perspective. Importantly, Markel are still the lead on the program.
Absolutely.
And that was something that was important to Emergence because Scott and his team have been fantastic supporters of Emergence over the last few years. So, Scott, what's the largest claim settlement you've been involved in?
Good question. So personally, $10 million as my own born line size for a risk, but that was part of it, and it's worth pointing out for those that aren't as familiar with the London market, the concept of towering and complex towers for global risks. So there's interestingly a claim going through the market right now without naming any individual names. It's a global hotel chain. Now that, I think as a market claim, if you read everything that's in the press, is likely to be circa $400 million. So it really is indicative. The bigger the company, the more records they have, the more complex their information technology and operational technology, the more significant the losses can be. And we're regularly seeing complex towers placed in London for large entities between 100 million and I think the largest I've seen so far is $600 million US for one particular risk. So yeah, clients are buying more limit than before. Look, they have claims. That's what we're here for as insurers. And ultimately, it can be a big number, but that's exactly what you go into as an underwriter with your eyes wide open when you quote these businesses.
And that's why programs are structured on towers to bring that capacity into the market.
Yeah, risk sharing. It's what we do as an insurance market very well.
Yep. So could you give us an example of a threatened attack versus an actual attack? So this is an expansion of cover that Emergence introduced last year to deal with feedback from the market to suggest that an event is not always going to be an actual cyber event. So can you talk us through your experience there?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's a really good example that springs to mind, and that's DDoS attacks, so distributed denial of service attacks. It's the concept of flooding a website with so much demand that it actually falls over itself and fails. So I suppose you could use the analogy of a shop on the high street having so many pretend customers at the front door that the real customers can't actually get in the shop. Now, DDoS attacks, whilst they can be very significant, are often preceded by a sort of test DDoS attack, then an extortion demand, and normally in the form of an email to a business saying, you presumably just saw what we did to your website. If you don't wire us a few Bitcoins in the next few days, we'll take your website down for a period of 3-4 days or whatever that number might be. It's an interesting exposure in particular for the gambling industry. So I can tell you that it's well reported in the public domain. Back in August 2018, there was a sort of quite a few online poker and gaming entities that were hit, which seemed to be a connected DDoS attack for a sustained period of time. And actually, they can be very significant threats. And it's an example of a threatened attack versus an actual attack. As an insurer, I don't think you want to wait until an actual attack occurs if you can mitigate that when you act when the threat originally arrives. So yeah, I think it's a really good example, and yeah, good policy should look at threats as well as actual attacks.
What are your thoughts on social engineering cover? It's one of the fastest or the hottest topics in the Australian cyber and crime markets. It's well known in the marketplace that the ML and the crime markets are getting absolutely smashed on social engineering claims. What are your thoughts on the cover?
Yeah, it's an interesting cyber cover. I see it as a more traditional scam or crime in its most basic context. I think, albeit committed, utilising computers to execute the threat. So I think the threat is heavily mitigated and managed by risk management. And I think it's amazing the amount of businesses that with a simple callback process or some sort of two-factor authentication, you can undermine a significant amount of the attempts of this sort of threat. So I think there's another problem here. You see a lot of different policy language cover out there that has varying extensive cover, but also sometimes with conditions precedent and things like that. I'm not a fan of that. I think you should underwrite a business from the outset and either include cover for it or indeed decline to quote the business based on the information you're presented with, rather than insure it and then wait until you get to a claim moment and then tell a policyholder that because of a condition precedent, you're not covering their issue. So really, in summary, it can be covered for the right price with the appropriate question set, and in my opinion, no conditions precedent.
Yeah, it's an interesting issue in terms of how do you underwrite the risk? Do you provide cover and then say at the time of claim, we will re-underwrite the risk and see whether you comply with the conditions precedent? It was interesting, I was listening to a global cyber insurer the other day who said that they provide social engineering cover and with no conditions precedent. And their view was, if you want social engineering with conditions precedent, we will provide you with a substantial reduction in premium, because their view was they were never going to pay a claim. So I thought that was an interesting thing. Our role as a cyber underwriter in the Australian market is to try and provide solutions for brokers and their clients. We're constantly asked about social engineering. Our challenge is, how do you underwrite this in a way that's sustainable? The crime market and the ML market have proved that the current approach to writing social engineering isn't working for them because they're losing a fortune. Our view is, when we provide cover, we want to underwrite the risk up front. We want to decide what an appropriate premium is and then manage the claim, not re-underwrite the risk when the claim comes in.
I agree. And I think it's also fair to say there's a lot of market movement and there's a lot of cyber markets the world over, be that London or elsewhere, that are adjusting their stance on this cover, which is really proof that actually some markets are getting it wrong, some markets are getting it right, and there's a lot in between. So yeah, very interesting cover.
Yeah, and I think it's going to play out in a number of different ways over time. Insurers who are in the process of remediating their books are pulling that cover back. So it'll be interesting to see how it all unfolds. So, Scott, what sort of industries have you got appetite for?
So I made the point, I think, a few questions ago. Portfolio diversification is a real cornerstone of certainly how I built my cyber book over the years. And actually, what I would say is there's some obvious ones. The industries that are buying cyber, they're queuing at the front door to buy cyber: retail, hospitality, FI, healthcare. So I think pretty much mirror the Notifiable Data Breach top 5 list, as Jerry read out earlier. It's no surprise that they're the first to want to buy cyber cover, but slightly more unusual. Let me give you a few of the sort of industries that I don't think are commonly thought of. So gambling, I mentioned before, online gaming, gambling is a significant thing. Video gaming, it's a huge industry now, and depending on which country you're in, it often is a bigger revenue yielding industry than the movie industry right now, and actually that's pretty amazing. The whole concept of, unfortunately, I've got 2 teenage boys myself, and online gaming is a big cornerstone of growing up nowadays, and all that entails, whether that be availability and uptime of systems, tournaments that are happening, prize money, etc., etc. And then the third one I'd say is industrial risks that are often overlooked for cyber, because people think, oh, they don't sell online, they don't have transactional, they don't necessarily need their systems to send emails, they can still manufacture things. Actually, the reality is operational technology has cyber threats embedded in virtually every business, including industrial ones. So yeah, there's some of the examples I can think of to mention today.
Thanks, Scott. Moving on to limits. What sort of cyber limits are companies buying from an SME and a corporate perspective? Both sectors are very different in terms of their risk profile and their need for balance sheet protection.
Yeah, so I think that let me start with the large corporate space. So I mentioned some of the towers that I see purchased in the London market. I think there are associated catastrophe-sized losses that accompany those purchases. So, no huge surprise, all of the big corporate breaches and huge cyber headlines come from the very biggest risks. And as a result of that, those businesses are learning that they should be buying more limit than they've ever thought of before. I mentioned before 100 million to 600 million range for a large risk cyber tower. And yes, we are seeing regularly on many businesses arriving at their next renewal date wanting to buy a bigger limit than the year before. So, maybe a European risk buying a 50 million tower last year is talking about 75 or 100 this year, partly to address GDPR and some of the things that brings about, but also just an awareness of the threats day in, day out that every business is facing. I think it's also important to point out that the cat losses that are fueling demand are often coming from some of these nation state issues that I mentioned, albeit no one ever admits them, sort of Eastern Europe, Russia, North Korea, the same old adversaries that are fueling some of these incidents. And also finally, contractual demands, contractual obligations. The moment GDPR came into effect, we saw a lot of large businesses putting in contractual terms and conditions into place that basically said the contracting party must buy appropriate cyber insurance to address GDPR fines up to a limit of X. And that immediately pushed a lot more demand into the cyber market. So yeah, it's lots of different areas pushing it. And it's almost the perfect storm, but let's not forget the claims are arriving as well.
No, fair enough. So cyber, as all brokers tuning in today know, it can be a hard sell in Australia, trying to demonstrate to clients why they need an insurance policy that they've never bought in their lives. So what type of claims are you seeing across the globe that can help brokers explain to clients why it's an important risk that needs to be managed?
So yeah, I'm not actually going to answer that one with a claims example, but actually I'm going to use an analogy that I've often stuck to over the years, and it's the sort of statement of be a chameleon. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think if any of you brokers walking into a client meeting with a preconceived list of 10 things you want to talk to that client about, I think if you're doing that, I think arguably you could do it a bit better. What do I mean by that? Well, I think almost assessing the needs and the exposures and the activities of a business when you walk in to first see them, then from that deriving the list of obvious exposures or heads of cover that are going to be most in demand or most useful to that business. So it's really about being a chameleon, working with your surroundings, trying to blend in, for want of a better phrase, and work with the exposures that you see presented on that risk. I think it's a lot easier, if I'm honest now, and I acknowledge I empathise with all of you brokers, because selling cyber is a difficult gig, without a doubt. But I promise you, 18 years ago, it was a hell of a lot more difficult. You would walk into a meeting and the technology director or the CISO would come out and would be introduced to you, and I'm the guy that's basically walked in there telling them that they're not doing their job right. And the two aspects of risk mitigation, risk management, and risk transfer were often viewed as mutually exclusive rather than being complementary. And I think the reality is, in the same way when you leave your house in the morning, you don't cancel your home insurance when you've locked the front door, would the two work in tandem collectively together. So the same should be applicable in the cyber world.
Yeah, it's very true. It's a constant challenge for clients, and when we meet with clients and brokers, there's a fair amount of the time the IT manager is there, and the point that we try and make is our job is to support your activities. Is you can only do the best you can. You are given a set amount of funds, and then you work within that budget.
Absolutely. If a hacker's got you in their sites, no amount of money or risk management will get you out of their sites.
This talks about the whole sophistication of who you're up against. So, Scott, can you talk us through an interesting claim that you've been involved in?
Okay, I think you're going to regret this one. Apologies in advance. This is a bit risque, but I think it's you asked an interesting claim, and here's one. So we had an interesting client. There's a manufacturer of adult toys. they were embracing the 21st century with the whole Internet of Things gig. Some of the devices, without being too crude, were specifically meant to be operated in an over the Internet of Things context, meaning that perhaps one half of a relationship could be controlling a device from the other side of the planet or something like that. Now that's all well and good until the manufacturer of these toys were collecting all of that data in the background on usage of frequency, severity, and all of those insurance words that probably don't work in a context like this, but I'm going to carry on finishing this sentence. And the reality is that information was breached, went into the public domain, and yeah, clearly it was a tad embarrassing for some of the users that had some of their usage history exposed there. So I'm not going to say any more on it because I think I'm going to get in some sort of trouble. But yeah, that was possibly the most interesting cyber claim I've ever seen.
Scott, that makes our claims sound very boring. So, have you got any examples of businesses that have suffered a cyber event and not recovered from it, or their cyber insurance has saved them from liquidation or extinction?
SMEs just don't make the headlines, understandably so. Nobody's buying a national newspaper to read about a small local business. So the reality is it's easy for everyone to say this stuff only ever happens to the big businesses because that's all I read when I open the newspaper. The reality is for every one big business hack, there's dozens, if not hundreds of small business hacks. They, of course, don't get reported in the same way. I would say that a lot of SMEs, I believe, and Jerry, perhaps you'll elaborate on this from an emergence perspective, but I think a lot of SMEs don't think about cyber insurance or certainly don't persuade themselves to come to the negotiating table until after they've suffered an event. Is that a trend you see?
Absolutely. The amount of submissions we get for clients who've had a data breach that was uninsured and now they're exploring it as a solution for clients, it's just one of those constant things. So we try and understand what's happened, and one of our questions, as most of the brokers we deal with will know, if you had a data breach and you come to Emergence, one of the questions we will be asking is, what did the client learn from the event and what remediation steps have they taken to ensure that the thing doesn't happen again?
Yeah, and actually, there's sometimes mixed opinion in the insurance market on this, but I'm a fond believer that if a business that's had an uninsured event and then spent some money to make good the situation, arguably they're better rights than businesses that have never suffered an incident at all. And from that perspective, as you say, if they've made the right corrective actions, well, fair play. I think actually that they should be greeted by the insurance market, with an appropriate deal.
Yeah. And that's why we like dealing with you, Scott, because you're of the one mind. If somebody's learned from a mistake or learned from having systems not configured the way they should, and they got the message and they've done something about it, well, my view is they're probably a better risk than they were. It's where the insured doesn't get the message and now wants insurance to fix the issue without going to the core of the problem, then that's somebody we'd have an issue with. So Scott, thanks a million for your time. Very much appreciated. Welcome down under.
My pleasure. Thanks for listening, everyone.
So let's move on to the important issue of why businesses buy cyber insurance, and that's claims. Jeff Gonlin, our legendary US Brains Trust, is with us again today. Jeff is the head of underwriting and product development for Emergence. Jeff is also going to walk us through one of our claims that we were dealing with recently that presented some challenges, as they always do. Good news about Jeff's photo. Jeff's getting a new photo for the next webinar as well, so he's going to look very dapper after his performance yesterday. So, Jeff, over to you.
Best photo I have, Jerry. Okay, what we've got, this is a pretty straightforward claim. The big move, it's a transport and warehousing industry. We've got a removalist up in Queensland. They've 12 million size turnover. They bought a $2 million policy limit, which looks pretty good. $1,000 deductible, 60 days indemnity. So what happened? typical, Jerry talked about the human errors. And well, when you click on that attachment and you unleash the ransomware, that's our most frequent sort of claim. In this case, it knocked out the insured system. They had a complete loss for a couple of days with some gradual restoration, and it took a while to get the thing back up and running. They did have backups, which is always good practice, but the ransomwares get more they just get trickier and trickier, and sometimes they destroy the backups as well. So they actually didn't really get full system availability there for till a few weeks later. Systems had to be rebuilt, and the data re-entered over time. Some of the manual work and overtime was required. Some things had to be manually sort of reconstructed. The policy response was pretty straightforward here. We had cost C, or the section C rather, which covers your response costs. So when rebuilding the servers and the recovery of the data and such, that's all covered. And section A, because they did suffer some disruption of their business. We covered looked at the loss of revenue, and there was some extra operating expenses, from the employee overtime and such. What can we say about it? It was predominantly section A, the business impact. The total bill came to about 168 grand, which again was mostly section A. Could this have ended differently? Well, yeah, I think it could have. And what I want to illustrate with this claim, it ties in with a question we often get from brokers, which is, how long of an indemnity period should I recommend, or how long, how much should the insurer buy? Well, the insured can choose with Emergence. We're not fixed on the indemnity period. We're flexible because we recognize that everybody's got a different business and different revenue stream and different concerns. In the removalist business, there is some seasonality, so you'd probably want to look at your peak season and orient towards that. The other feature here is their sort of revenue stream, how that cycle works. The cafe on a corner where you pick up your coffee, well, that's pretty, pretty straightforward. If either they're open or they're closed and they're selling or they're not. With the removalists, you get a variety. Some people want to move today, have something moved, tomorrow, next week, maybe next month or next quarter. So, it spreads out. When they're out for 2 days, they don't just lose those 2 days worth of bookings. It's that 2 days over the spread of times. And when the outage lasts for 2 to 3 weeks, then they're going to have a whole series of contracts, both short, mid, and longer term, that are lost. Those opportunities are lost. Nobody's going to wait for you. They'll find another removalist. In this case, they had 60 days. They should have bought probably 90 days. It was just about 100 days or so before everything was all said and done. So, a 90-day would have really covered them better, and that 168 would have been certainly a bit more than that. We see some people, some insureds buying 30 days, and that's your cheapest option, of course. When you think about the notifiable data breaches effect, you have 30 days to notify people then, or to sort things out. If you do have to notify them, and you're in a business, a high trust business, if there's going to be some sort of public relations or loyalty effect, it's probably going to kick in after you notify people. So right when your indemnity period is running out is when that effect's going to kick in. Again, everybody's business is going to be a little bit different. So you have to look at the nature and the needs of the business, taking a seasonality, the revenue cycle, and the public perception and brand equity into account. So I'm going to tell you a story at this point of there was a group of people. out in, the outback on a journey, and they came to a bank of a river, and they decided to set up camp there. Once they'd set up, this booming voice from the heavens said, "Look along the riverbank, and you'll see stones and rocks, and take some with you. Take as many as you wish, but take something." And some of these guys thought, "What the hell is this? This is nonsense. I'm not going to load up with rocks." And other ones thought, "Well, it's a booming voice from the heaven. I better do something anyway." So they all did whatever they felt was appropriate, and they crossed a river. And then the voice had said, "You'll be both happy and sad." And once they crossed the river the next day, the booming voice said, "If you look in your bags now." And what they found was those rocks turned into, nuggets of gold and diamonds and rubies and other precious stones. And the voice said, "Now you are both happy and sad." And they understood the meaning of that. And that's the story of insurance. So if you're going to buy something, at least buy something on cyber. Buy the minimal product if that's all you can afford. But don't just go for the 30-day because it's cheap. Buy the 60 or buy the 90, or think of what really it is you're trying to protect, because it's that value once you cross the river. That's what you got to keep in mind, not that rock you got in your pocket, that darn insurance that I got to keep paying. I'm going to leave you with that, Jerry.
Thank you, Jeff. Entertaining as always. So what I'd like to do now is bring you up to date with what's been happening at Emergence. Last year was a very, very busy year for us, with NDB scheme coming in, new cyber wording, increased portal capabilities, additional staff, and massive growth in policy count. We also built the geographical footprint of Emergence. We opened a Newcastle office last year, and a couple of weeks ago, we opened our new Melbourne office under the stewardship of Trevor Rossi, who's a 20-year professional risks veteran with an experience in insurance underwriting, broking, and reinsurance. For the last 2 years, Trevor has been one of you in the broking space, so he understands what you're dealing with when talking to clients about cyber. We're very excited about having Trevor as part of the Emergence team and look forward to building our presence in the Melbourne market. In the background, we're working on what we call Emergence 4.0. We've got a lot of exciting ideas for the evolution of our business, and we will include coverage enhancements, technology solutions, services to support our broker partners and their clients. So you'll be hearing more from us about all of that during the year. In the meantime, we'll continue our commitment to focus more on educating our broker partners through such things as webinars, website blogs, broker presentations, and LinkedIn content. If any brokers listening today require access to the Emergence quote and bind system, please email info@emergenceinsurance.com.au and request access. If you need support using the portal, you can contact anyone in the Emergence team. Due to the continued support, our underwriting team also continues to expand. Since our last webinar, Laura Mansfield has joined us in Sydney and Trevor in Melbourne, and we're working on further building out the Melbourne team. For assistance on any cyber-related issues, please feel free to contact any of the growing Emergence underwriting team or our incident response team. Speaking of incident response, which is the cornerstone of what we do at the end of the day, there's been no change in our solution, which is managed from Sydney in partnership with Sedgwick, the rebranded name for Cunningham Lindsay. They understand the importance of immediately mitigating potential threats to your client's business. The Emergence Incident Response team is available 24/7 and manages the claims process to minimize the threats and save clients money. I said we were running a competition today. Firstly, congratulations to Mark Perry of Melbourne Insurance Brokers, who won our November webinar competition. Today, you can win a fantastic Google Home for any of you who follow Emergence Insurance on LinkedIn between now and next Tuesday, the 5th of March. So if you don't already follow us on LinkedIn, jump online now and click the follow button. We will advise the winner of the prize by email next Friday, the 8th of March. As I mentioned earlier, all attendees today will be entitled to 1 CPD point. We are automatically sending out the certificates of attendance to the email address you used to register for this event. For those attendees listening as a group, such as in a boardroom, please send a list of attendees now, including full name and email address, to info@emergenceinsurance.com.au so we can issue each attendee with the certificate of attendance. A number of you have posted questions, so let's deal with as many of them as we can. Thanks, Troy. What have we got?
Thanks for the cameo, Jerry. First one, do you want to come up here, Scott, please? How far behind is the Australian cyber insurance market to that in Europe and the US?
Good question. Not a hell of a lot, to be honest with you. I think it's easy to forget the US has been significantly ahead of virtually every geography for cyber insurance. Why did that happen? Well, you guys, it's a year old now, Notifiable Data Breaches. California, I believe it was 2001 that had their first equivalent, their first statute, obviously in California, requiring notification. So look, they've had 17, 18 years of regulation fueling increased demand, and because of that, evolution of thinking on policy wordings and everything else. And it's, to be honest with you, a much bigger market size than all other geographies combined. But look, Australia, I don't think is so much further behind than the UK and Europe, to be honest with you. So yeah, all good.
What about blockchain? Have you seen any advances in that? I've got a question around here around, do you see cyber risk changing with the introduction of blockchain?
No, I don't. So I was having a debate internally at Markel a few weeks ago on exactly this subject. Blockchain, as I understand it, as I'm reliably informed, is only as secure as the IT infrastructure and risk management and protections that underpins it. So look, blockchain, if set up in a secure, well risk managed environment, yeah, it can bring huge benefits. But ultimately, if blockchain's set up in an insecure fashion, it's not really going to do much for your corporate anything.
Question here. What's the best, so this is in terms of trying to set limits. So this is going back to the points that we made earlier today around what's the best procedure to have a conversation with a client around setting an appropriate cyber limit?
Sure. So I think that even forgetting what the exposures look like or what the covers look like, I think you can almost rewind for a second and ask the obvious question that in many other lines of insurance you would ask. What sort of balance sheet here are you comfortable with as a business? And then fast forward from that, trying to sculpt a program that gives them the appropriate protection. I mean, you could answer the question differently and say, how do you quantify a loss? Obviously, the business interruption angle is a bit more easy to get your mitts around, but the notification of cyber incidents can also be quantified. I think Jerry mentioned some stats earlier. In the public domain, you can get some info on that. So liability is the more difficult one to quantify.
We've just got a question here around threatened attacks. So, for instance, an activist group against an animal farming organisation. So, I think what they're trying to get at here is how do we differentiate between what's threatened and what's credible?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I think it is, you know, hearsay in the public domain is one thing, and I don't think many insurers would act on that to trigger cover. But I think real tangible threats, so as in either an email arrives initiating something or threatening to initiate something, I think that absolutely would be. And I think you also find that most of these morally activist-driven incidents are actually sometimes very difficult to argue whether they are or are not terrorism, which is why you see a lot of cyber policies that get rid of all of that ambiguity and just say they're covering hacking. They don't deem it a form of terrorism in any way.
So I'll answer this one because it's easy. What's the business interruption waiting period? That's 12 hours. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, Troy.
No worries. Cheers. Thank you. There's an anonymous question here. Do you provide social engineering cover under your cyber policy? Jeffrey, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, we saw, well, it's not really a defined term. People understand different things by social engineering, but if we think of the, the key element here being the, you're hacking the human, so the human ends up making some error or mistake. We've seen that those are very prevalent sorts of things from the NDB report. Our cover does, and always from the start, provided for coverage for miscellaneous errors. I think usually what people are concerned about here is the sort of funds transfer, that you lose money because of doctored invoice, or you didn't do authenticate, and the 50 grand is gone. So we're very aware of how important this is, especially for the small businesses, and we've been studying this. We've had a position that has been pretty clear up till now. We are taking a very hard look at this, and I think next webinar we'll have we'll promise to have something one way or the other to you as to what our capabilities will be.
I've only got a couple of minutes. We've got a question here around Emergence, the practice of Emergence giving Google Homes to everyone as a spying device. Yes, it is. And Mark, once he got his prize last quarter, he's been listening to Katy Perry nonstop. So we'll see what happens next quarter. One last question has just come in, so we'll tick this off. So when a client is confronted with a ransom demand, how quickly do the incident response team crack the key code and utilise it for the use of future victims?
Good question. It's an interesting one. So it's worth pointing out that it's always better to try and deal with this with experts rather than just as any old company. I've seen in the London market businesses try and deal with this stuff themselves and not via trusted third parties that have a proven experience dealing with these sort of outfits. And, funnily enough, you shouldn't trust criminals. And when they say they'll give you a decryption key if you give them X or Y, you should probably assume that they might not. And actually, there are ways and means for the experts to make that work. And as the writer suggested, to learn from the last incident and fix it for the next one.
I think one of the other things, Scott, also is it depends on what the strain of the ransomware is. So if we're dealing with an established strain where we can get access to the de-encryption code because we've seen that strand before, then that's a much quicker process. But if we're dealing with something that we haven't seen before, and we had an interesting one a few months ago where as we were decrypting the various folders in the client system, the ransomware was re-encrypting the folder that was just opened. So it really depends sometimes on what you're dealt with and how to manage it.
And, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to just say, we've got, so we're not necessarily looking to crack the code. We're looking to decrypt the data and get you back in business as soon as possible. But there are people who do that for a living, who try to reverse engineer these things. And we are in touch with top experts who are around the globe, and depending on the strain and who everybody's got their sort of specialty in that area. So you don't want to rely on one company either. You go to whoever can do the best job on that variant of ransomware. So you got to figure out what it is you're dealing with first, and then go to somebody who's got the key.
That's all the questions, but while Jerry's giving me the microphone, as you can see, we're constantly growing, but we're also constantly in lookout for good people. So if anyone out there knows anyone that may be a good fit to Emergence, please let me know, because we're constantly looking to continue to build the team. Jerry, over to you.
Thanks, Troy. If you find anybody that's better than Troy, well, then just let us know. That'll be handy. So I'll leave you with a bit of a thought about managing passwords. So on behalf of Emergence and Scott Bailey, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us for today's webinar. I hope you found it educational and useful in building your own cyber knowledge. and giving you the tools to assist in having a more informed conversation with your clients. We are recording the webinar today, and we'll send those of you who have registered for today's event a link in the near future so you can share it with any other staff who were not able to tune in today. We will also send you a short survey to gain your feedback on today's webinar and to get your thoughts on what cyber-related topics you'd like us to deal with in future webinars. We'd really appreciate if you complete the survey and return it in the next few days. It'll take you about 2 minutes max. We will use the feedback to plan our webinars for the rest of 2019. The next webinar in our series will be in May, so keep an eye out for that. We'll send invites out a few weeks beforehand. This is the official end of the webinar. Thank you for attending, and all the best.